Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. So calming our instincts is automatically a way to massively improve our quality of life. It's going to make our digestive system work better, our immune system work better. It's going to reduce chronic pain because the cortisol and the adrenaline create inflammation. It's going to give us access to our executive thinking brain. We're going to be more resourceful and creative with problem solving. We'll sleep better. We'll have better relationships because we can be more present with the people in our lives. There's so much cool stuff that comes out of having your fight or flight calm. And on top of all of that, one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and a lot of people are passionate about, in this time and becoming increasingly aware of, is that as we regulate and calm our instincts, we're going to be better at anti-racist thinking and work. This is also going to counter homophobia, sexism, all of these kind of ways that we harm people by objectifying them and reducing them and telling really harmful, untrue stories about them based on something about who they love or the color of their skin or their gender or all of these kind of things. And I want to share a little bit about why that happens when the instincts are running the show. So as humans, we are in this interesting position of having our amazing frontal cortex and thinking brain mashed together with this much older instinct center that has been around a lot longer. And the instinct center is going to interpret the world very much as a hunter-gatherer person would see it. So it's trying to respond to the modern world as though you were still a tribal hunter-gatherer person. And the executive brain, the thinking brain, is resourceful and can respond in the moment. Kind of halfway in between is the times when we find ourselves employing strategies from childhood that were really effective for staying safe as a child. So sometimes I run against people who kind of have a knee-jerk fibbing reaction. You ask them something or whatever, and they bounce back with a lie instantaneously, and you're like, well, wait a minute, you said you didn't print the document and I just watched you do it and it's sitting on the printer. Like what's the deal with that? And yet their knee-jerk reaction is that that's someone who probably grew up with some really bad consequences if they got something wrong in childhood, and that's carrying over to a not so functional adult behavior because knee-jerk lying isn't going to make you very successful at work or at home or in relationships or, all of these kind of things. So how our brain responds to the world around us is a really important thing to understand because we actually have a lot of control and ability to affect how that works. And by using as much as possible, we can move through the world in a much more graceful way, and honestly with a lot less damage in our wake of harm and stress to other people. So one of the things that I really look for in maturity is, does this person pay attention to the ripples of their actions on those around them? And a more stressed, instinct-driven person is probably going to go deeper into the making themselves right, making everyone else wrong, rationalizing the harm and the impact of their actions on others, rather than being available to see the effect that they have moving through the world. So anytime you can say, wow, I got this unhappy result with a number of different people, I'm the common denominator, I should look at that, you're moving in a very sophisticated and powerful kind of way as far as navigating the world. So my favorite sources for really understanding the way that our brain understands the world, there are two books that I think are magnificent. I like both the audiobooks. And one of them is How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big by Scott Adams, who's the author of Dilbert. And it's a lot about breaking down in a fun, engaging kind of way how our minds are not super good at mapping reality. They're designed to help us survive, not get killed, and procreate, but they're not concerned with quality of life or self-actualization or moving through the world with elegance. Those are more sophisticated functions, and the instinct brain doesn't care. It's not its job. Its job is to keep us from stepping on snakes and getting killed by a member of the neighboring tribe. I think it's sobering to recognize that archaeologists have found that about 17% of our hunter-gatherer ancestors died from human-to-human violence. This is according to a fellow who wrote a book about Angels of Our Better Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, and he's looking at all the evidence. And so it doesn't include getting cut and getting an infection or, getting eaten by a tiger or walking off a cliff or a dangerous fall or dying in childbirth. This is some other person killed you, and that was the cause of death. And so there was a lot of competition for resources and violence between early tribes. And if you're feeling like people aren't safe, they're going to hurt me, they're going to get me, they're going to harm me, your instinct mind might be in the driver's seat, because for sure there are dangerous humans and it's good to give them a wide berth, like, the emotionally unregulated, mentally ill person screaming at people in the, produce aisle at the grocery store. By all means, go do your shopping in a different aisle when that's happening. But sometimes I deal with clients who've just wound themselves up to the point of feeling like their very safety, their physical safety, is in danger from some amorphous threat. The other book that I find really, really useful is Dr. Tara Stewart's The Source, which really gets into neuroscience meets law of attraction. And so those are two resources. Just to complete my thought, I tend to move in circles as I talk about things. But those are some really good resources if you want to geek out and understand this concept more deeply. I appreciate Brené Brown in general, but one of the things I think she articulated really well in one of her books is that when we are in stress state, there are enormous biochemical rewards for categorizing someone as friend or enemy. So the ability to say, Joe from engineering is having a bad day and he's grumpy, and I heard a rumor that, his wife wasn't super happy with him and, he snapped at me. I probably want to tread with care. I may say something to him if he's crossing too many lines, but, we've generally got along. It seems like he's having a hard time. I want to understand if I interacted with him in a way that caused that response, or, there's ambient stress that's kind of leaking out. That would be a sophisticated, mature way of looking at the situation. Whereas, if you're like, he's my enemy, he's horrible, that would be a more extreme instinct-driven kind of response to a trigger of someone participating with you in a way that wasn't so great. So how does this all circle around to making us better at anti-racism and just anti-hate in general? All those ways that there's this amorphous hatred for groups of people based on a story that our minds tell about them. So when the instincts are in the driver's seat, they're going to interpret the world as though you had a 17% chance of dying from someone else killing you. And so there's a lot of instincts that happen around that about how you want to make sure people like you, even if it sacrifices vital things, even if you give up safety. And we can usually look back to our childhood and find moments where we didn't speak our truth or stand for what would have worked for us because the price was too high. There was too much safety risk. There was too much of a downside of the needs that would be less well met, including, physical safety in that moment, versus the satisfaction of being fully expressed. And that pressure was probably many thousands of times more acute for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. The tribal thinking of us versus them comes from this part of the brain. So the novel beauty of the modern era is our ability to choose again. If you're in a relationship and your beloved becomes an alcoholic and starts being violent with you, you can leave. You can step away in most cases. Certainly there's a lot of infrastructure that helps people in first world countries say, I'm not down for that. I'm gonna go figure out my life somewhere else where I'm not living under the threat of violence. Or if you grew up with a really toxic family of origin, you can have your family of choice. You can choose people that are more aligned, that treat each other in a way that feels good to you and helpful. If you're at a corporation that is a really toxic environment for the employees, you can brush up your resume and start looking for another job. And this privilege and freedom that is so much more available in the modern era than it was to our ancestors isn't something the instinct brain has a reference for. So it wants you to make it work with your tribe, no matter how toxic. And we can see good examples of that in history when people were practicing human sacrifice. People were leaving babies by, out in the frozen wilderness to die. There were these things that really go against what would work for someone that they went with and they agreed to and they participated in because of the pressures of the tribe. Because for our ancestors, to be cast out of the tribe was a death sentence. So we have a lot of sort of instincts that are about do whatever will make people happy. And one of the things that we're seeing in the modern era is this divisiveness, us versus them. And it's all scrambly because, for a while back with the 2016 election in the United States, there was some really intense divisiveness by political party, a lot of intense stories of us versus them being told on both sides. And then COVID came, and suddenly people from both political parties have different opinions about masks and vaccinations, and people are really dug in with people who think differently are wrong and bad. And there's all these ways that the us versus them is really a moving target, and that's very much instinctual tribal thinking that distills people down. Objectification is making someone like some small part of themselves. So if you're looking at someone as being completely defined by their opinion about a mask, then you're objectifying them rather than seeing the fullness as a person. And our brains do that. So one of the things that's super useful to understand about our brains is they're this amazing supercomputer that take a lot of calories to run. Our brains are very calorically intensive, and most humans throughout history have struggled to have enough food to be able to survive. So the usefulness of making every calorie count is a lot of stuff that's woven into us. As a sidebar, it's part of why we can struggle to exercise, especially when we're tired or depleted or anxious. Like we all know that getting our heart rate up and burning out the adrenaline and the cortisol when we're in stress state would be really good for us. We have that knowledge intellectually, but there's a lot of instincts that say, if you're in stress state, don't go burning your resources. A hunter-gatherer person would never go for a run in the morning just because, that would be cuckoo. If you're running away from something or you're chasing food. That's why you run. And there's a little side category of sometimes devotional practices. There's a version of it when we see these sort of extreme triathlon athletes doing it for a version of self-efficacy and self-actualization and religious intentions. So sometimes people push their body in extreme ways, but on an average day, you didn't waste calories. And our brains have all these ways of trying to save on neuroplasticity, which takes a lot of calories. So when you believe something about the world and you get new information and you change your perspective and you change your mind and you make a different choice, that's activating neuroplasticity. If you learn a new language, that's activating neuroplasticity. And anyone who's done an immersion language course as an adult probably found that in the beginning they were so tired at the end of the day because of this incredible activation of creating new neurological connections as they tried to onboard a new language. So our brain is always trying not to work any harder than it has to, which has some good sides, but it also has some real downsides for our resourcefulness and our intelligence and our creativity and our ability to get out of those false dichotomies where you're like, there are only two possible solutions, kind of black or white thinking. Because if we don't change our mind, we save calories. So there are even these weird mechanisms in our brain, like confirmation bias, where someone can have a fact that is presented that shows that someone's assumption about the world is incorrect, and the person's brain will hear that fact as confirming and proving that their incorrect belief about the world is actually correct. It's a really crazy thing that our brain does. And again, the Scott Adams book is a really great way to kind of illuminate and have a deeper understanding of how do we use our brains to the best effect to have a life well lived, and how do we know when we can trust our thinking. And one of the things that's important to know is humans can rationalize anything. And a lot of times we have a desire or a want or a fear, and then the brain is pressed into service to making it sound reasonable. And that is something that can be really hard on relationships. It can be really hard on limiting choices. So people will always have a reason that sounds good to them for some behaviors that are not that defensible, that, an objective, calm observer would say, you did a really terrible thing. You caused a lot of harm there. And yet our brain rationalized it before we took a questionable kind of action. People can behave very much in contrast to their values when this mechanism is happening. So coming around to what does this mean for modern people? And so one of the things that I'm really clear about as a woman is that being a woman and being in grace with myself means a certain amount of sweeping out the trash of the ideas that are absorbed by osmosis in our culture that are very harmful, like my value being tied to my weight or my beauty or my youth rather than any of the many, many other qualities I possess. And I find that a really toxic, perceived social value, and you have to have as much as possible, is a really toxic, harmful, scientifically eroding happiness belief. We can really understand scientifically where people who are having high levels of perceived social value as a motivating decision maker end up with reduced happiness. It's not so supportive for making choices that actually bring us happiness. And yet our instincts look to something like perceived social value because capitalism gives us these messages. You'll be liked, you'll be loved, you'll be respected if you have the white teeth or you drive the fancy car. And they use imagery to associate those things in our brain. And really the core survival intention is if the tribe likes me, they won't kill me, they won't throw me out. My safety is assured, and likewise I can, keep my babies alive, keep my children alive, which are really important, vital things. Our many times ancestors that were indifferent to survival, procreation, keeping those children alive, those are not our many times great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers. We got the people who cared about these things as a breeding program. And so that's in us. It's in us in a really deep way. And so I provide my instincts response to those messages with adult supervision so that I don't reduce my self-esteem on a day-to-day basis based on, these markers that I don't really care about. And similarly, when doing anti-racism work, we have a society that is filled with racism. We get a lot of really racist messages and information. And I would argue that a similar process of actively sweeping out the trash, as far as, don't believe everything you think. It's not your fault what comes into your mind, but you are accountable for what you allow to stay there. That that going in and questioning those stereotypes and those ways of looking at people that dehumanize them, that make them less than, that justify harm done to them, is a really important sort of practice and tending the garden of your mind. If you're going in and sort of pulling these weeds, you're not going to get as far sucked down a slope of rationalizing something really indefensible. But this is really sophisticated work. So our brains are trying to categorize things. So they sort of have a heading of snakes in general that they treat in the same way that they treat venomous snakes. So, there's a treat it like a venomous snake. And then if you deal with snakes a lot, you might then evaluate what kind of a snake it is and how much of a problem it is. But sort of the default is see a snake, create some distance, ask questions later. See a stick that looks like it could be a snake, back away until you're really, really, really darn sure that that is absolutely positively a stick and not a snake. And this is woven in instinctually even with animals. I watched the neighbor's boxer puppy jump about 2 feet in the air because she wasn't paying attention to where she went. She looked down. There was a stick that she didn't realize was there, and she jumped in the air. It startled her. So these responses are really woven in deep ways. It's not that we're being taught that you don't want to step on a snake. That seems to be a installation for, adults past a certain age, a certain, discernment about the world. It doesn't mean you're phobic about snakes. It just means that we have a lot of bias to not accidentally having close encounters with them. And this, way of categorizing things, edible plants, not edible plants, I want to eat it, I don't want to eat it, is an efficient way to deal with the absolutely insane amounts of data that modern humans have to deal with. There's so much that we're asking of our brains that none of our ancestors really needed to do. Now, they had deep expertise in other areas of, farming knowledge and woodcraft and, just deep understanding of things. But modern humans, just the amount of facial recognition we need for the people that we encounter is so much greater than our hunter-gatherer ancestors or our farming community ancestors. So when it comes to something like racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism, any of these discriminations, our brain is trying to categorize, an us versus them and simplify people into this one characteristic and unfortunately make a lot of really negative, problematic assumptions about them that we're absorbing from the culture. Because one of the strengths of humans is we can absorb a lot of information about what our tribe values and what they don't like. We don't have to transgress against every value of the tribe and get in trouble to learn what is and isn't okay. We have all these ways that we're taking in cues subliminally and that are woven into this story of reality that our brain creates. And the trouble is that unless you organically have an experience with a wide variety of people, you can end up with a view that is absorbed from a culture that had vested interests from way, way, way back when, and saying that, this select group of people got the power and the money and these people didn't, and then came up with rationalizations for it. So I minored in women's studies, and it was really interesting to see that at the time that in the modern era, these democratic notions of government emerged, so moving out of feudalism into industrialization and into elected forms of government, there were these rationalizations for why the common man, of the ethnically dominant group that had control of the money should be allowed to have a voice in government, but why all these other people should remain disenfranchised. And there were great essays and all manner of things written rationalizing this motivation. And that's the legacy that has been handed down. We have this as sort of this unconscious thing that's operating in the background in our culture. So, if we want to do housekeeping, recognizing that if our instincts are in play, it's going to try to have us categorizing people in a way that's objectifying, that takes in the dominant cultural view, that absorbs a lot of really negative and untrue, inaccurate stereotypes, and simplifies people down. And what we want to do when we calm our instincts, we can bring actual rational thought and say, that's a ridiculous idea. What an absurd notion, that this, incredibly misogynistic or racist thing would even remotely be true. We have this ability to question that if our executive brain is online, and we have the ability to be present with the people we're with and see them as a human being with all of their complexity, which is a trait that is really lost to us when our instincts are stirred up or turned on. Again, there's this desire to be for me or against me, in my tribe, not in my tribe. And one of the things that's really interesting is certain people who are deeply racist or deeply sexist can have a member of the population that they're so prejudiced against and just make an exception. They're like, oh, but not John, he's great, or not Susie, she's lovely, but all those other women or all those other people of color, because of the way our brains work. If they're in relationship, then the human experience can trump the prejudice that's absorbed without ever actually dismantling the overall structure, which is one of the kind of things that's weird and problematic. So you can have a bunch of data points that these people are not that way through direct experience and still hold that belief. So our brains are this weird and quirky and amazing and complicated piece of hardware and software, and they're really cool. There's a lot that's amazing about having a soul that's in relationship to a vessel with this, brain, this biological brain, and understanding it more deeply, understanding that there's effort that needs to go into the neuroplasticity to decide in a way that is kind and clear and coherent and accurate, that there's effort that's needed, and there's a part of you that's adverse to that, so we'll rationalize that that's unnecessary. I think it's one of the reasons that we're still even having a conversation about whether racism exists or is harmful. You can go into the statistics and see access to healthcare, access to money, home ownership, infant mortality, lifespan, education. Like you can look at the statistics are all there. We can look at how this shows up, and without even getting into the whys and the wherefores, which are super complicated. I've been studying this actively since high school. I got really offended. I was 5 years old, and I was living in San Jose, and there were these two gals, Tiki and Miko, who were the absolute goddesses of my existence because they let this 5-year-old little girl follow them around. So I adored them, and they told me one day, oh, this kid who lives on the street, he threw a rock through our window. And living in a very nice modern family of treating people with respect, I was like, why would someone do that? It was horrible. It was outside my understanding of how it was okay to treat people. And they just said, well, because we're Black. And I believed them because I absolutely trusted them as a credible source, and I could not possibly make sense of this data point I had. So, I went home to mom and dad and asked them like what's the deal? And they explained, in appropriate for 5-year-old terms about racism and that sort of thing. And it's the first thing I remember really being an argument about the world. I'm like, that is not right. That is not okay. I don't agree to that. And so here I was in a, conservative, small town, agricultural, Northern California. The town I grew up in had 3 stoplights, and I had to go like 2 cities over to get to the library that had information on ethnic studies and to read Black writers talking about their experience historically and in modern times. But I was compelled to seek that out. So not trying to get into the incredible complexity of how racism functions and is shored up. But what I do want to offer is that When you understand what your brain is trying to do and why it's trying to do it, and you calm your instincts, you can create the self-efficacy to say, yeah, I unconsciously absorb racism and I want to sweep out the trash that's come into my brain. There's a lot of ways that this came in. I came by it honestly, and I'm willing to tend the space of my brain. I like to think of my mind as being a good neighborhood, which has a lot to do with, do I talk to myself nice when I'm tired and emotional? Do I think kindly about other people? Do I make generous assumptions about where they're coming from? Do I, hold empathy when I feel like I'm right and someone's wrong? Do I have the ability to question that instead of just cycling on shoring up my justifications? So there are many, many, many reasons why our quality of life is so improved when we calm the fight or flight system, from our physical health to our emotional health to our lifespans to it being probably the best anti-cancer drug. I think, calm the instincts beats out kale smoothies every day of the week. Nothing against kale smoothies, but there's so much that we get out of this. And one of the things we get out of this is the possibility to not objectify people, to not categorize people, to not take away their humanity when we think about them. I feel like one of the things that I can really offer to my clients is being able to hold them in whatever they're struggling with, even if I would do it a different way. And that deep non-judgment is a cultivated and tended characteristic that I pay attention to and that I actively work on. And similarly, it's really useful to understand why our brain might default to some really unfortunate beliefs and views about the world that are often self-harmful. I don't think there's a huge correlation between people who are really filled with hate about other random groups who are genuinely kind to themselves or their family or their relationships, or practicing sobriety and mindfulness. I think there's a lot of correlation between as within so without. Like, it's been my experience that if you're filled with hate, it's hitting you inside as well as outside. But starting to understand the mechanisms that are in play, why your mind latches onto stereotypes and tries to make decisions, is just trying to offload brain function by not having to get curious and present and take in data points, because that takes a lot of effort from the brain. The brain has to work really hard. But our modern secure access to food gives us this really cool opportunity to be better than our ancestors. We have access to information, we have access to neuroscience, we have access to food for the most part. So we can afford to run our brains in these more sophisticated, powerful, potent ways. And I'm not saying you want to do this 24/7, but having the ability to get your brain to really work and remap reality in an up-to-date way that's more supportive of you thriving in the world is a really good thing. So I hope that this is helpful and supportive. I'm very aware that as a white woman, despite, having, again, done my best to educate myself from a really early time, I'm not an expert. I've studied it, but I'm still a layperson. There are educators who are far, far better at teaching this sort of thing. And there's an aspect that no matter how much I've studied it, I haven't lived it. I've had all the privilege of a lot of different things: able-bodied, mostly straight, white, middle class, education access. There's a lot of ways that my life has been very privileged. And so I just want to acknowledge that context as I delve in and I share something about this subject. I think they're important conversations to have. And at the same time, I just want to acknowledge my limitations. So I hope this is helpful for you. There's a lot here. There's a lot that I've woven together, as I shared, from multiple really potent sources in service to being in right relationship with our instincts so they don't make us unpleasant people without realizing that they can be overridden. We can work with them in direct and potent ways. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.